Okay, it's 2 minutes past 7, Mark. I suggest we kick off.
There you go.
Okay, so hello, good evening, and welcome to the Battle of Sedgemoor Revisited. And it's great to see people dialing in from all over the world. Fantastic. This evening, we're here to take a fresh look at the Battle of Sedgemoor with the aid of some expert speakers and some new research. This really is a unique event, not been done before. So please bear with us, and we hope you enjoy it. My name's Simon Howes. I live in the village of Chedzoy, which is on the edge of, or one edge of the battlefield. I'm joined this evening by my friends and neighbours Mark Holder, Nick Griffiths and Jonathan Dethier, who you'll hear from later. Our audience this evening is, as we've seen, is international, fantastic. But we have, locally, we have landowners and farmers who own and occupy the land in and around the battlefield. We have battle reenactors. We have people near and far with an interest in the history of the battle. So you're all very, very welcome. So our speakers tonight are, first up will be General Sir Jack Deverell. Jack's a local lad, raised in Somerset, I believe, Jack, 38 years in the British Army, commissioned into the Cornwall and Somerset Light Infantry, so very, very local. And your final appointment, Jack, I have as the Commander-in-Chief, Allied Forces, Northern Europe, no less. So Jack, now, we understand you're now retired, but one of your many interests, and the reason you're here this evening, is because you conduct battlefield tours for the Battle of Sedgemoor, and that is indeed how we met a couple of years ago. So welcome, Jack. And our second speaker is Stephen Carter, who is author of this very, very good book, which you'll hear a few references to this evening, Fighting for Liberty. Steve is a self-confessed military history geek. He spent 20 years in the Sealed Knot doing battle reenacting all the way from musketeer to colonel. So I think he's probably had a few broken fingernails over the time. And he's spent time reenacting the Monmouth Rebellion, particularly marching around the southwest, campaign marches, battles at the original sites, and conducting talks. And we met when Steve was conducting his research into his book. We actually spent some time looking around the battlefield and talking about some of our local knowledge, actually. So welcome, Steve. You'll hear from both Jack and Steve shortly. Before we jump in, I'm going to pass you over to Mark Holder, who's just going to give us a couple of minutes on how to get the best out of this evening through Zoom, and a couple of words on this evening's charity. So Mark, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm sure all of you over the past year have got familiar with Zoom, but just in case you haven't, if you're on, that's the first test, so well done. This isn't a Zoom meeting, it's a Zoom webinar, which is why you've all been put straight to mute, and your view is restricted, or our view of you is restricted. But as we've asked, let us know where you're from joining. Give us a thumbs up. I think we're okay so far on people hearing us. Get ready for an engaging session. There's two ways of communicating with us. One is through there's a chat. If you put something in there, everybody else is going to see it. You can address it just to the panelists, or you can address it to the whole of the community on the call. If you've got a specific question, then use the Q&A, and please, throughout the session, please pass over questions. We'll cover off Q&A and the ability for you to ask questions, but please feel free as you go through to do so. We are recording it, and I will just say a few words about the ABF. Simon mentioned before, in more normal times, in fact 3 years ago, we were very privileged to have General Jack conduct a personalised tour of the Battle of Sedgemoor, the one that Jack normally delivers in conjunction with the ABF. If you don't know the ABF, they're the Army charity. It does really important work to support all current and former soldiers and their dependents who are in need. And you could say that would have been quite relevant to probably some of the victims of the battle a few years ago here. So we thought it'd be a good idea just to ask you, if you could, to make a small contribution. If you've got a couple of quid in your pocket, then there's a link that Nick will share now to a Just Giving page. It's quite straightforward. I'm sure you've all used them before, and we will share it at the end. We do have Peter Bates, who's the regional director for the Southwest of ABF, plus other members of that team on the call now, which is really great. And I'm sure if you've got questions about the charity, then throw those into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that they get answered as well. And as I mentioned earlier, Nick will also share a small brochure about the charity. So we'll mention that at the end again, but let's get on with the core of this evening, and I'll hand you back to Simon.
Thank you, Mark. So hopefully everybody's seen this with the invite that went out, and it was on Facebook as well, but I'll just quickly skip through the agenda. So parts 1 and part 2 are both going to be covered by General Jack, and they are setting the scene, what was going on in 1685 before the battle and what led up to there being a battle at all. And then the second part of that is what is the established history of the Battle of Sedgemoor from contemporary sources and historical sources. What is it we know and we believe we know about the Battle of Sedgemoor? So to really set the scene and to warm us up and remind us all of the subject matter. And in the next section, we're going to hand over to Steve Carter. And this is really what makes this event unique, because Steve's book and the research for his book has come out with some real revelations. And I'm not going to spoil his thunder, but I think some new evidence has come out and some new theories have come out, and Steve is going to present them. We called it myths, mysteries and misconceptions. And we're going to look at what is it that we may need to think differently about when we think about the Battle of Sedgemoor. And then following that, we're going to have a discussion between Jack and Steve to sort of compare the two sides, actually, the established view and the new theories, but also taking perhaps Jack's military experience, because I know some of Steve's evidence is from a military practice perspective as well. So we can get a bit of a behavioural, psychological viewpoint as well, perhaps, Jack. So that's that section. And then at the end of that, we're going to just give you a few minutes of insight into the work we've been doing in Chedzoy locally on our own research and our own findings about the battle from our perspective, from the perspective of the village. And right at the end, the Q&A. So if you do want to ask any questions, we may or may not pick them up as we go through the event, but I hope we'll be able to pick them up at the end, and then we'll be able to field them to the right person. So really, I'm getting in the way of progress here. So the purpose really is to, I think I've said it, there's a lot being written. We've got some new evidence. We really want to lift the lid, open our minds, test the new theories. We're not seeking to rewrite history, but I think we are perhaps looking to add a little colour and depth in our understanding of what may have happened. But most importantly, we want to inspire more interest so that we can all look at this further into the future. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jack. And Jack, please take us in your time machine back to 1685, if you will.
Well, thank you. And firstly, thank you for asking me to do this. It's an enormous pleasure, and I'm delighted that there's been so much interest being shown in it, and from places so far afield. I just need to make one comment first, that I am effectively going to read a script, which I don't like doing. And the reason I'm doing it is because my internet connection in third world Wiltshire is so bad here on basically 1 megabyte that I'm likely to disappear, perhaps to the relief of all from your screen, and not reappear. So if I do disappear, then Mark or somebody will read the script from where I've got to, and it means that he knows what I've said and he knows what is to be said. So I apologize if it's a bit stilted, but it seemed the only way of us overcoming the appalling internet service that we've got in this bit of Wiltshire. As an aside, it was mentioned about I think it was Mark who mentioned about the ABF and how those soldiers who fought in the Battle of Sedgemoor might have needed the ABF. What is interesting, of course, that the Royal Hospital Chelsea was created, and the first people in the Royal Hospital Chelsea were the wounded from the Battle of Sedgemoor. And the level of detail that we have about the Royal Army casualties really is testament to the care that was taken of them by that institution, which was founded by James II. I'm going to initially talk about why the battle was fought. A very quick run through some of the main causes of the Monmouth Rebellion. Like so many conflicts in Western Europe at that time, the underlying cause of the Monmouth Rebellion and the Battle of Sedgemoor that ended it was religion, and the inability to separate religion from politics. The gunpowder plot of 1605 and the alleged papist plots of the 1670s and 80s sustained a widely held fear of the return of Catholicism. At a political level, it was felt that the loyalty of Catholics could not be guaranteed, that their allegiance to their religion was greater than to their monarch. In the eyes of the British in particular, the Catholic Church supported two of Britain's long-term adversaries, France and Spain, and thus were supporters of absolute rule, an anathema to the majority of Britons. The view that the reactionary stance of the Catholic Church would undermine the role of Parliament was particularly acute amongst the gentry of the Country Party, which later became the Whig Party, who wished to see the House of Commons assume greater authority at the expense of the monarch. The religious rather than the political consequences were more keenly felt amongst the nonconformists of the country, many of whom regarded the Church of England as little more than the Catholic Church without the Pope. It was they who were fearful that they would lose what little religious liberty they had. Nonconformity had particularly appealed to those who lived in small towns, local tradesmen, artisan craftsmen, people who were independent, thoughtful, and religious. They made a good living and therefore had much to lose in times of political or religious instability. These people had been particularly influenced by the spread of the English translations of the Bible and were increasingly unwilling to accept the authority of the church, the behavior of which seemed at odds with their interpretation of the Bible. Such skepticism with the prince's spiritual was easily transferred to the prince's temporal, and many of them espoused both the Puritan faith and Republican politics. The failure of the Commonwealth after the death of Oliver Cromwell and the restoration of Charles II failed to eliminate their Puritan attitudes, their Republican ideals, nor did it eliminate the distrust of Catholics. A crisis began to unfold when in 1675, James, Duke of York, converted to the Catholic faith. Like his father, Charles I, and his brother, Charles II, he had a Catholic wife, Mary of Modena. James's first wife, Anne Hyde, was a Protestant, by whom he had two daughters, both of whom would become Queens of England, Scotland, and Ireland in their own right, Mary and Anne. By a quirk of fate, Charles II and Catherine of Braganza could not produce a son who survived childhood, whereas Charles's bastard sons proved rudely healthy. The eldest of these, James Barlow, as he was called, later became the Duke of Monmouth. His mother, Lucy Barlow, otherwise Lucy Walters, something of a chancer, was one of Charles's many lovers when he was in exile in Rotterdam, before the Restoration in 1660. There was a story believed, held to be true by James Barlow, but always denied by Charles II, that Charles had secretly married Lucy and therefore James was legitimate. The absence of a legitimate heir meant that Charles II's brother, James, Duke of York, became the rightful heir. Suddenly, the three kingdoms were confronted with an uncomfortable fact that on Charles's death, there would be a Catholic on the throne with a Catholic wife, and therefore every expectation that the heir would also be Catholic. From 1675, the House of Commons attempted to exclude James, Duke of York, from the throne. Both Catholics and nonconformists, who were also seen as a threat, were excluded from public office through the Test Act and Exclusion Act. At every stage, Charles II said that the accession was not a matter over which Parliament had authority. But there were mixed messages. Since the Restoration in 1660, James Barlow had been acknowledged by Charles II as his natural son and treated as if he was the Prince of Wales. He was made Duke of Monmouth, given all sorts of senior appointments in the army, fought with distinction in the Low Countries, both for France and the Dutch, successfully ended trouble in the Scottish borders with Covenanters at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge. and was responsible for many administrative changes in the army. He proved a popular and well-liked figure, especially in the southwest of England. But he liked to be liked and could be overly loyal to friends. At times, he was a poor judge of character and was easily manipulated. Some political factions played on his growing bitterness that Charles II would not declare that he was his legitimate son, and people began to call Monmouth the Protestant Duke and the Duke of York the Catholic Duke. This association with the anti-York faction and an alleged link with a plot to kill both the King and the Duke of York caused severe friction with his father, and Monmouth left England for Holland. In early 1685, Charles died, and rumours spread that he'd been poisoned by the Duke of York. Monmouth was persuaded to gather together a few trusted supporters, equip himself with some arms, ammunition, and armour, hire 3 ships for which he had to sell his mistress's jewels, and sail for England to raise an army in the southwest in tandem with the Duke of Argyll, who led an uprising in Scotland. It was with this motley band that he set sail from Texel on the 1st of June 1685, bound for Lyme Bay. I'm going to cover in outline the preliminary operations that led to the decisive battle of the campaign at Sedgemoor on the 6th of July, 1685. Having sailed from Texel on the 1st of June in these 3 small hired vessels with 83 men, 4 brass cannon, about 1,500 breast and back plates of armour, and a similar number of helmets and matchlock muskets, plus a stock of powder and shot, the force arrived off Lyme Regis on the 10th of June and landed on the 11th of June. The events of the next 3 weeks are worthy of a study of their own. Monmouth's plan of campaign was built more on hope and promise than expectation. His expectation was based on the promise that a significant proportion of the Whig gentry, as well as non-conformist artisans, would flock to his colours in the southwest. The hope was that this and the actions of the Duke of Argyll in Scotland would create such uncertainty in London that James's legitimacy would be undermined, and that the merchants of the City of London, backed by the mob, would call for and force the king to give up the throne. But first, he had to raise a substantial army, equip it with weapons and equipment that he had brought from Holland, and hoped to seize additional equipment, most likely from the militia. He had to select and train his junior officers and non-commissioned officers, and train his army to fight against a well-equipped and well-trained professional army in which he had served and knew well, and they knew him well. Within the first couple of days, he'd collected about 1,500 recruits from the local area around Lyme and into Devon. He felt strong enough to fight a minor skirmish with the Dorset militia in Bridport, 10 miles to the east of Lyme. However, he had suffered 2 blows, one linked to the other. Immediately he'd arrived at Lyme, he'd sent Thomas Dare, a Taunton man, an influential Taunton man, to one of his anticipated supporters, the Prideaux family of Ford Abbey, about 10 miles north of Lyme. He expected to get horses and men, but got horses only. This was the first sign that the Whig gentry were reluctant to support Monmouth, and this was to become ever clearer as the days passed. The chosen commander of Monmouth's mounted troops, Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun, was a fine soldier but a volatile character. When Thomas Dare returned with the horses, there was an argument between Dare and Fletcher over a horse, and Fletcher shot Dare dead. Monmouth was forced to send Fletcher back to Holland, and he appointed Lord Grey of Wark to command his mounted troops, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Monmouth then began a march of some 180 miles, which you can see in outline here. This took him through parts of Devon, Somerset, and Wiltshire until arriving back in Bridgewater on the 3rd of July. The reasons behind this march were really quite straightforward. He needed to avoid being pinned down by the Royal Army. He needed to spread his message in order to pick up more recruits and demonstrate his freedom of action. He needed to train and harden his army and its command structure, to establish the resilience and trust through shared experience that was necessary for him to confront the professional army that would be put together against him. Finally and crucially, he had to feed the army. And the only way of doing that in those days was by moving from place to place. It's interesting to reflect that for every 100 horses, there was a requirement of about 3/4 of a ton of fodder per day. Each man needed something like a pound of meat or cheese and about a pound of bread. So for every 1,000 men, an army needed nearly 1 ton of food per day. By the time he got to Taunton, he'd amassed an army of somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000, it is said, and had 600 horses, and therefore required about 9 tons of food and nearly 5 tons of fodder per day. And this came from the locals, which is exactly why armies were deeply unpopular. On the 5th of June, through the decisive action of Nathaniel Wade, the commander of the Red Regiment, one of his infantry regiments, the Somerset and Devon militia were prevented from combining at Axminster. Indeed, many of them came over to Monmouth with their weapons and uniforms. The militia as a whole had shown little inclination to fight. Collecting more recruits as he marched, Monmouth moved to Taunton, the most rebellious town in the southwest, as it was known, where he received a great welcome, having had a small skirmish at Ashhill on the way. To the surprise of many, he declared himself king, possibly because he believed it might help to play down the fear that he was leading a rebellion to overthrow the monarchy and not just James II. It was then decided that he should attempt to seize Bristol, then England's second city. To do this, he decided to cross the Avon at Keynsham and approach Bristol from the east. He had at that time little idea where the Royal Army was or what it consisted of. In fact, when the news of the landing reached London on the 13th of June, a small force of infantry and horse had been sent from London under John Churchill, a former military colleague of Monmouth and the future Duke of Marlborough. They had reached Bridport on the 17th of June and then headed north after Monmouth. On the 22nd of July, after a significant period of drought, which in fact had lasted nearly 2 years, it began to rain. And on the 25th of June, on the 22nd of June, after a significant period of drought, it began to rain. And on the 25th of June, having successfully crossed the Avon, the rain convinced Monmouth to return over the bridge to seek shelter in Keynsham. In doing so, he blundered into Colonel Oglethorpe of the Blues, part of the Royal Army, who was intent on doing the same thing, that is, find shelter. There was a chaotic encounter, which unnerved Monmouth, who feared that Oglethorpe was the vanguard of the Royal Army rather than a relatively small reconnaissance force. Monmouth then began to chase shadows. Bath rebuffed him, and stories of men in Wiltshire took him towards Westbury. There was a fierce exchange between Monmouth and the Duke of Grafton, his half-brother, at Naught St. Philip on the 27th of June, but none of this activity appeared to be having any effect in London. And on the 29th of June, he heard that Argyle had been captured. Monmouth had been losing heart for some days and decided to return to Bridgewater. He was responsible, he was sitting on a diminishing asset. From the high point of about 10,000 men, he was down to around 4,000 by the time he got back to Bridgewater. It was equally clear that he was having little or no discernible impact upon his anticipated supporters in London, amongst the Whig gentry, nor upon James II. On Sunday, the 5th of July, having been in Bridgewater for 2 days, his command group, as we would call them today, were in St. Mary's Church discussing what to do next. It must have been a depressing moment. At 3 p.m. on that afternoon, Benjamin Godfrey, a cowherd, arrived at the church, sent by his master who lived in Chedzoy, to tell them that the Royal Army had arrived in Western Zoyland, 3.5 miles away. Having questioned Godfrey, he was then sent back the 3 miles to Western Zoyland to find out more information. I think personally it is unlikely he went alone. There is a story that Monmouth himself, having observed the Royal Army from the tower of St. Mary's Church in Bridgewater, went to Chedzoy to observe more closely. Whoever did what, it is clear that Monmouth had a reasonably clear idea of the layout of the Royal Army in Western Zoyland upon which to base his planning. It is often inferred that the Royal Army was not being particularly diligent in establishing a sound defensive position and were drinking rather too much cider. There's plenty of evidence that this is not so, and I expect that Monmouth knew well enough Churchill was going to be, that Churchill would not be a soft touch. It's sometimes said that Monmouth's attack next morning was a foolhardy enterprise, and he was bound to lose that battle. I believe there was a much more straightforward explanation for his decision. He had no choice. At a range of 3.5 miles, the Royal Army was just over an hour's march away, and between 15 and 20 minutes on a horse. And these timings are critical. Monmouth was running out of options. He could establish a defensive position in and around Bridgewater, but it was far from certain that Feversham, Lord Feversham, now the commander with Churchill as his second in command, would attack. I doubt if Feversham would have felt any urgency to attack because he was still numerically inferior in regular troops. What was more concerning for Monmouth was that Feversham was substantially superior in artillery. And what Monmouth would not have known, but may have guessed, is that in any case reinforcements were on the way to Feversham, including an artillery train from Portsmouth. He knew that his mounted troops, Monmouth's mounted troops, lacked the training and experience, both in terms of horses and men, to be effective against the mounted troops of the Royal Army. This would have been made worse as he moved out of the close country of Somerset into the more rolling country of Wiltshire and Hampshire. This made any move towards Bath or Salisbury risky. To go north to Gloucester or Bristol meant having to cross the Avon and perhaps be trapped against the Severn. To retire to Taunton would be seen as a mission of failure. So if he was to move, then to where and to what end? The main problem of moving was breaking clean. With Feversham so close, he would find it very difficult to slip away and put several hours between the two armies. He had to assume that Feversham would have him under some form of observation and would have early warning of any move. He therefore had the very real prospect of his rear and flanks being continually harried by Feversham's mounted troops, and any delay imposed by an obstacle, even the crossing of a relatively small river, could mean that Feversham's main force would be able to engage with the main body of Monmouth's force itself. His only hope, in my view, was to deliver a blow to Feversham that would enable him to break clean while Feversham was forced to stop and to lick his wounds, as so to speak. The news of such an action might also be the catalyst required to start the reaction in London that he had been seeking, but had so far failed to achieve. It was all or nothing, but in reality he'd reached the end of the road, and I suspect he knew this. He may of course have gone through none of this thought process and selected the options by drawing lots or sticking a pin in a piece of paper. Who knows? However, Monmouth conceived a plan specifically aimed at neutralizing what he identified as Feversham's advantages. He neutralized the Royal Army's artillery, which was covering the Bridgewater-Westonzoyland road, either side of which was the most favorable ground, by choosing a less likely approach, which also enabled him to incorporate a preliminary action akin to a commando raid under the cover of darkness to neutralize the effect of Feversham's mounted troops. I have no example of such a military action being planned or conducted by anyone else around this particular historical period. Maybe, I don't know it. I want to take a moment to look at the relative strengths of the armies. In Westonzoyland, the Royal Army was superior in both numbers and quality in mounted troops, and vastly superior in the number of artillery pieces. Monmouth's superiority, as we can see from the slide in front of you, which is a slightly complicated one, but you'll see the numbers at the foot of each column. Monmouth's superiority lay in the number of in the numbers of infantry, an advantage to the tune of 1,000. This was tempered, of course, by a lack of training and experience, and a dependence on the matchlock musket, whereas the Guards Regiment in particular were armed with the more reliable and were flintlock. Dumbarton's and the two Tangier regiments had matchlocks. Much has been made of the idea that Monmouth's army was made up of disaffected agricultural labourers armed with pitchforks. There's no doubt there were a considerable number armed with 16-foot poles with a sharp agricultural implement attached to the end, but in effect, that was all the issued pike was. However, the slow rate of fire, the short range, effective about 80 yards, inherent inaccuracy of the musket and the lack of an effective bayonet meant that troops armed with pikes were vital to protect the musketeers whilst they reloaded. It is also worth noting that, and records showed, that the structure of Monmouth's army was far from being a pitchfork army. Over 50% of that army were over 30 years of age, and figures taken from just 19 parishes showed that agriculture accounted for only 11% of the army, as opposed to cloth making, which provided for 53%. What is often not taken into account, and I think Stephen will comment on this, is the presence of the Wiltshire militia, perhaps 3,000 of them, positioned in Middlezoy. Why Feversham did not integrate them into the main position is unclear. It could have been that he wanted to keep them as a reserve, or because the fighting qualities of the militia had been exposed in the initial encounters in Bridport and Axminster, and Feversham simply didn't trust them. Turning now to Monmouth's plan. Monmouth's plan was to move from Bridgewater at 2300 hours along the causeway towards the Bath-Bristol road. Could I have the next slide, please, the Chedzoy slide? Thank you. You can see Bridgewater on that slide and the causeway leading up towards the high ground to the northeast. He then planned, as he approached the Bath-Bristol Road junction, to cast off east, skirting Chedzoy to the northeast, past Peasy Farm, and then follow the line of the Black Ditch to the Langmoor Stones, at which they would cross Langmoor Drain or Langmoor Reen. At that point, his mounted troops under Lord Grey would assume the lead and move ahead of the main force to find the upper plungeon and cross Bussex Reen there just before first light. Sunrise was 0410, and therefore first light being 1 hour earlier at 0310. It was intended that Grey should be crossing the plungeon around about 2:30. It's claimed by some that Monmouth told Grey that all he had to do was to lock the troopers in their beds, take the baggage train, capture the guns, and turn them on the Royal Infantry. I believe Monmouth was an experienced enough soldier to realize that such orders made no sense. It was understood that the horses and the baggage train, those horses which had not been deployed, as we will see later, and the baggage train were in the area of Weston Hall in the centre of the village. And as we know, the artillery was covering the northwestern approach, or the western approach of the main Bridgewater Westonzoyland road. Any commander would be very hard pressed to control 600 horsemen, it's the number that Monmouth's army had, in the dark and the close confines of the village. So it is questionable whether Monmouth was prepared to commit all his mounted troops to this part of the plan. Mounted soldiers find it difficult to capture people. They're very good at dispersing them, but not very good at corralling them. Mounted troops do not like dismounting in the middle of a battle, as somebody else has to hold two horses, effectively incapacitating them. It's highly unlikely that Feversham's troopers would have been in billets anyway, as he had insisted that the horses were tacked up during the night, and he would have been unlikely to have allowed his troopers to spread themselves out around the village. It makes more sense for Monmouth to have told Grey to stampede the horses by cutting them free from the horse lines, which they would have been kept in, rather than trying to somehow capture or lock up the troopers. This would have achieved the same end, in fact, rather more dramatically, because it would have got rid of the horses and hopefully created confusion by stampeding the horses so that they careered around Feversham's position. Whilst this preliminary disruptive operation was taking place, Monmouth's infantry and artillery would cross Langmoor Rhine, move to their battle positions on the northern side of Bussex Reen, form line from column, and be ready to fight at first light. His initial order of march from Bridgewater was that the infantry should lead, followed by the mounted troops. This was partly a matter of security. It doesn't matter what you do to muffle the noise made by a horse's bits, its tack, and its hooves. Horses are innately noisy, and they churn wet ground into thick mud. It's worth noting that nearly 3,000 infantry marching in 3 or 4 ranks will create a column at least 1,000 yards long. And with the inevitable concertina effect, this will often be longer. Add to that 600 horse and artillery, and the column will be at least 1 mile long. Moving at 1.5 miles an hour, which is probably the best speed you would expect at night, such a column would take between 40 and 45 minutes to pass a point. We have to remember that the soldiers would have been wearing shoes with plain leather soles, which would have had none of the traction of a modern walking boot. This would have meant much slipping and sliding. Marching long distances at night in wet, muddy conditions with a pikeman behind you, sticking the base of his pike in the back of your leg on a regular basis, is physically demanding and mentally draining. And it's a measure of the discipline that Monmouth had imposed upon that army that 5-mile journey was made, and the army arrived at Langmoor Rhine in good order. Contrary to the idea that Feversham was lazy and incompetent, the layout of his force, though unconventional, was comprehensive. As we've already mentioned, his artillery was covering the road to Bridgewater, with his infantry covering the northern or right flank of the artillery, using Bussex Reen, which is marked on the map as covering the northern and western side of Western Zoyland. Bussex Reen, as I've said, stretched around the northern and from the west through the north to the eastern side of the village. It was described as being about 20 feet deep. I'm sorry, it was described as being 20 feet wide and knee deep, though it is supposed to have had a very muddy bottom. Churchill had insisted that the infantry slept in tents directly behind their battle positions by some 150 to 200 yards, a further indication of the general preparedness of the Royal Army. More comprehensive even was Feversham's use of his mounted troops. Having placed detachments on the bridges over the River Parrett at Langport and Borough Bridge, effectively closing off those options to Monmouth, he sighted infantry pickets to the west and east of the village, and he sent Colonel Oglethorpe with a detachment to Knoll Hill to observe the Bath-Bristol Road junction, to give him warning of any attempt by Monmouth to move off in that direction. Monmouth anticipated this and is said to have moved his baggage train to the area of the junction in order to be part of a rather straightforward deception plan. Feversham placed Compton's troop in the area of Langmoor Rhine, covering that alternative approach. Interestingly enough, the sentry or sentries placed at Langmoor Stones was swept up by Oglethorpe accidentally, or perhaps even deliberately, although I can't imagine why, as he crossed on his way to Knoll Hill around midnight. So that crossing point was left unguarded. It's claimed that Feversham himself was out supervising this element of the screen until about 1 a.m. And I would suggest that these were not the actions of a commander who was either indolent or careless. I want now just to give you a rough idea of the ground that they were moving across and ultimately going to fight across. And you have a short video here, which Mark will put on.
So this is now moving from the end of Red Track past Mount Close Batch, looking out towards Moor Drove. And this will just go past Mount Close Batch and then stop, and you'll see some pointers on the ground to where the story will take forth from there. So we're looking down the centre of the battlefield, effectively. Western Zoyland, the memorial on the left-hand side, and then in front of us, Wade's last stand, and then the arrow pointing towards Chedzoy. Can you see the next slide, General?
Yep.
Slight delay, up to you. That's fine. Good.
I've got the. Thank you. Right. I'm now going to cover the sequence of the battle. Having sent his baggage train to that Bath-Bristol Road junction to give any recce force something to look at, Monmouth set out from Church Fields at 2300, 11 p.m. On the night of the 5th of July with Benjamin Godfrey as his guide. His mounted troops would not have left Church Fields until about 2340, as this mile-long snake wound its way east along the causeway in rainy, misty, cloudy weather. No doubt apprehensive of what was to follow. Previous meetings with the enemy had been largely chance encounters with little time to ponder. They were probably, and yet on this occasion, they knew exactly what they had to do. They were probably making 1.5 miles an hour and had some 5 miles to cover. This meant the leading elements would be approaching their battle positions around 0 to 20, with the tail some half an hour to 40 minutes later, nearer 0300, about 10 minutes before first light. Having left at 2300, about 10 past midnight, having done miles, the leading element turned off the causeway down Bradney Lane. 10 minutes later, it turned east along Marsh Lane. This took them towards the Black Ditch, which was intended to ensure they did not drift east away from Western Zoyland. It also kept them well away from Chedzoy. It is said that Monmouth avoided Chedzoy because of its royal supporters. However, there is a more pressing military reason. Nearly 4,000 men and horses going through a village for 40 minutes after midnight was going to get dogs barking, horses whinnying, and people throwing open their shutters with candles and lanterns to see what the hell was going on. With your objective only 2.5 miles away and secrecy being paramount, it was just not a risk worth taking. The head of the column would have reached Peasy Farm just before 0100. He had to leave an ammunition wagon at Peasy Farm, perhaps because it was making too much noise or it was defective in some other way. He'd already left one of his brass cannons in Bridgewater because of a squeaky wheel. Anyway, so far, so good. It would take him an hour to move the 1.5 miles he had to travel to Langmoor Rhine, or Rhine. The column was now on the open moor, and it's most likely he used this as an opportunity for his horse to start overtaking the infantry, so that they were at least nearer the head of the column when they got to Langmoor. Otherwise, there'd be a 30 or so minute delay while the mounted troops caught up. When they arrived at Langmoor Rhine, Godfrey could not initially find the stones that marked the crossing. After searching, he found the crossing, and Gray began to lead his men across. At some stage during the crossing, a shot was heard. It's claimed that it was treachery, and that a Captain Hucker of Taunton had fired the shot to warn the Royal Army of the approach. I find this unlikely, as it's quite a long-winded process to fire a shot at the best of times, let alone as an act of treachery when surrounded by your fellow compatriots. He was also later hanged, so if he did commit treason, it didn't do him very much good. It was much more likely that a sentry of Compton's troop had heard or seen something. Quite clearly, secrecy had been lost, the alarm was raised, and Monmouth told Gray to get on with it and make best speed. What follows is very confusing. The alarm was raised. Beat your drums, for the Lord's sake, beat your drums. The enemy has come. Compton's troop, as planned, fell back towards the upper plunging and bumped into some of Gray's mounted troops. In the standoff and confusion, shots were exchanged and Compton was badly wounded, and a Captain Sands took command and headed for the plunging. He was followed by a detachment of rebels led by Captain Jones, who then engaged in a prolonged and courageous but unsuccessful battle to get across the plunging. It looks as if Gray's force, whatever its intended size and structure, had broken into some smaller groups. It would have taken Gray no more than 10 or 15 minutes to trot the 3/4 mile from Langmoor Stones to Bussex Green, so he would have been there sometime after 2 o'clock, depending on whether he was involved in the skirmish with Compton or not. When he arrived at Bussex Green, he could not find the plunging. Had he done so, he might have found it already occupied by Sandy's troop. At this stage, I think Grey suffered from brain freeze. He had not shown up well at Bridport, having been seen to leave the battlefield early, but the pressure of events appeared to prove too much for him. He appeared to make little attempt to find the plungeon and appeared to have forgotten the critical part his force had to play. A more resolute commander, Fletcher of Saltoun perhaps, might have attempted, having realized that he couldn't find the plungeon, to wade the Rhine with the horses. And if that had failed, to have dismounted and attempted to take half or some part of his force across on foot. He could still have achieved, certainly by getting to the center of, on foot, getting to the center of Western Zoyland and attempting to stampede the horses, he could have still achieved at least part of what he was ordered to achieve. But he did the most extraordinary thing. He turned west and led his men across the front of the Royal Infantry positions. As they passed Dunbarton's regiment, they were challenged. "Who are you for?" "Albemarle," was the reply. As they passed the First Guards, "Who are you for?" "The King." "Which King?" "King Monmouth." Very helpful comment. After a few volleys, Grey's men broke and ironically created a blue on blue with Wade's regiment that were at that stage moving into their battle formation. Grey's men then poured back towards Langmore Stones, spreading the very same alarm and despondency and confusion among the rebel army that Monmouth had hoped they would be able to spread amongst the royal army. It was said later by Grey that he mistook the matchlocks, the glowing matchlocks of Dunbarton's regiment, for the lights of Western Zoyland. He must have known that Busseck's Rhine did not lead him into Western Zoyland, but led him round it. And what was going on in Western Zoyland would have been similar to that which might have happened in Chedzoy, in that the civilians, suddenly alarmed by what was going on, would have thrown open their shutters. There would have been noise, there would have been shouting, and all the cacophony of the alarm being raised. And I think his excuse of the glowing matchlocks does not bear study. Nonetheless, Monmouth managed to get his infantry and artillery into position. The Red Regiment Wade on the right, the Yellow Regiment Matthews in the center, and the Green Regiment Holmes on the left, with the White and Blue regiments in echelon to the rear. Though it was said that the White Regiment under Fuchs was so unsettled by Grey's retreat, they failed to play any substantial role in the battle. In spite of all this, and by chance, Monmouth had created an overlap on his left flank, the right flank of the Royal Army, and it was the flank opposite Dunbarton's regiment. His Brandenburg artillery commander started laying down some effective fire with his remaining 3 cannon on Dunbarton's regiment, whom Monmouth at one stage believed were beginning to look somewhat shaky. He tried to get his overlapping regiment, the Green Regiment, to cross the Rhine and outflank Dunbarton's, but to no avail. The confidence in your fellow soldiers that is needed to assault was more than that needed to stand shoulder to shoulder and exchange volleys. It was a stark reminder of the difference between professional soldiers and the spirited and brave amateur. This opportunity was quickly lost as Churchill, who at this stage was the tactical commander, moved some dragoons to strengthen his right flank and deter any crossing of the Rhine, and he began to move the 2 Tangier regiments from his left to his right. He also ordered the guns to be redeployed to support his infantry. When later Oglethorpe returned after a wild ride through the night via Bridgewater, to find Monmouth gone, crossing the River Parrett at Borough Bridge, and then to deliver some rather out-of-date news that Monmouth was not in Bridgewater, Feversham deployed his mounted troops to the flanks of Monmouth's army, and effectively the die was cast. Monmouth had no effective mounted capability to counter this threat, and it merely became a matter of time. I will end there because I've slightly overrun, and in any case, you can see from the map that the next slide, that there begins a general retreat of Monmouth's army. And I know that Steve has some interesting new perspectives on this, which I will then therefore leave it to him to introduce. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. And I'm going to hand straight over to Steve. We pick up at that point, or at any point you like, Steve. Please, over to you.
We've got to do our technical share now, so I'm going to stop sharing, Steve. It's over to you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So hopefully one can see my slides and my content. So thank you, General Jack. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and just to go into a little bit more detail, because there's a lot of high level 10,000 feet view of the campaign and the events, and this is what really led me on a journey to write the book Fighting for Liberty. And I'm going to just go through some of that journey that I went on to learn more about the battle, learn more about the campaign, but also learn more about Monmouth. And I'm not going to touch on his legitimacy or non-legitimacy, but what I am going to do is just look at in terms of the campaign, what happened. So the key thing is there are a number of myths, and General Jack sort of covered around some of those, and these are general things you pick on. There's that Monmouth ambled around Somerset, not really knowing what he was doing. The Pitchfork Army, and I'll look at some of these in lots of detail. The government camp, but again, we're sort of fairly closely aligned on that, but I wanted to go into more detail about what actually that camp meant and how those men formed up. There's another myth that Monmouth never knew about the Wessex Rhine, and again, I'll cover that, and the traitor's shot, I'll go into detail as well. The big one, this most probably controversial one, is that there's an overemphasis on General Churchill and Lord Churchill's role in the whole campaign. And I will cover that off as I go through, but definitely that he did not win the battle. And finally, I'm going to look at the myth that Monmouth basically abandoned the army and ran away halfway through the battle itself. To help me dispel some of these myths, I'll be referencing first-hand accounts, primarily Monmouth's account. That's never really been looked at before, and it's only really come to light in the last few years. But I will just go through that, and I'll bring that out as well. Obviously, all this stuff is available in my book because it's the research from it, but there are some things I'm going to cover that just go a little bit more about the theory around the book as well. So the first myth, and that's something this is what got me kicked off on history of the Monmouth Rebellion, was that this concept of Monmouth ambling around Somerset, because the first thing I did was I looked at the campaign, I looked at the maps to understand the typography of the landscape at the time. And you've seen this diagram. This sort of shows Monmouth's general route around the campaign route. What I'm going to do is just emphasize a few things. First of all, that yes, Monmouth did land with 83 men. All those 83 men were experienced officers. So you had men that had been served in the British Army, they served in the Army of Brandenburg. So they're all experienced men. And that was a core of his captains and officers. The second thing is that for the last sort of 3 weeks, men had been flooding into the West Country. Arms and equipment had been landing and going towards Taunton. And when Monmouth lands on the 11th of June, there are a couple of things here. First of all, before he lands, Colonel Werner, who is his captain, is basically foot general, lands early and goes to Taunton. Now, a few weeks before that, there was the letters were disputed through the Whig spy network or agent network. And some of those were captured by the government. And they had advance warning that Monmouth was going to land. But also because of the vagaries of transport in those days, they couldn't give a precise date and time of landing. And towards the end of May, early June, there were uprisings of men and cavalry reports galloping around Wiltshire. There were disturbances in Dorset. And because of that, the militia were called out. And more importantly, for the whole Monmouth campaign, is Colonel Werner goes to Taunton, and he goes for Taunton for a clear and decisive reason. And that is because it's, as General Jacks mentioned, the hotbed. It's also where all the men of the Whigs who are currently in the country are mustering. So that's where they're going. And Colonel Bovitt, for example, is a Taunton man. He's already there. Other men like Holmes marches there. Other people congregate there. And there are lots of government reports that there's a big group of people here. We don't know what's going on in Taunton. So when Monmouth lands, he sent Werner ahead, in my opinion, to raise and rally Taunton so those men could march and join him at Lyme Regis. Not so Monmouth marches to Taunton, but they march to Lyme Regis. And as I said, remember, the militia have all been called out. The Devon militia actually mustered in early June in Exeter. The Dorset militia had been mustering, the Wiltshire militia had been mustering, and the Somerset militia had also been mustering. The Dorset militia actually go, and their muster point is Bridport. Some of Somerset militia end up in Crewkerne. But more importantly, the Taunton militia under Colonel Luttrell all muster around about 9th of June in Taunton, effectively suppressing the uprising that was planned in Taunton. So when Werner gets there, he finds he cannot raise the town, and therefore trickles of men go and join Monmouth at Lyme Regis. The other very important thing on here is the road to London. Monmouth lands at Lyme for a reason. It's on the London road, the same reason as William of Orange landed Torbay on the same axis. It's far enough from London to allow him to muster his forces before he sets off, but also not far enough away that he can't reach London in a short period. All this comes not from my theories. This actually comes from letters that are in the public archives. So Monmouth does try and attack Bridport, not to effectively, he's trying to free up the road to discover there's 2,000 militia in Bridport, and he's only got a maximum at this point 1,000 men on the 13th of June. He also hears that the militia from Exeter are marching to, and the Somerset militia are marching Axminster. Therefore, he is forced, effectively, as General Jack said, to march north to Taunton to relieve the pressure, to get the men that are there, about 600-700 men, are waiting in Taunton for him. But also, if he gets cut off at Axminster, the campaign is over, full stop. So, yes, he marches north, brushing aside with at Axminster the militia units. And effectively, some of them come over to him. But when he gets to Taunton, what happens is the Taunton militia have actually marched to Crewkerne and Axminster, and therefore they've effectively been dismissed. The rest of Taunton militia there actually retreat to Wells, leaving their baggage and their equipment behind. And they leave the castle and all the armory that's full of equipment that's been raised over the years from the Whig uprisings that have been planned. So when Monmouth gets to Taunton, he's joined by a lot of men. He recruits his army, and it's around about 6,000 men that possibly 5,000 to 6,000 men that finally arrive with him by the 21st of June. Now, what's important here is that he remodels his army. So he's got a large army. He has brought a lot of weapons, and I'll come back to that in a minute with him. He's now at Taunton. Against popular belief, Churchill is now quite close to him on the 21st. However, he's at Chard with 2 troops of cavalry, about 100, 150 men at the top end, because against popular belief, Kirk and the artillery that formed his infantry brigade were actually still in Salisbury on the 19th of June with orders to march to Dorchester that Churchill never countermands. Secondly, when the artillery get there, a man in the ranks called Dummer writes on the 21st of June, they are in Dorchester. They received orders to march north to join Churchill. So you can see that effectively Churchill, although he's on the flank of Monmouth, he's in no position to actually carry out his orders. The other thing that's fascinating at this particular junction is the king in Whitehall learns of Monmouth's invasion on the 13th of June. On the 19th of June, he receives word that Monmouth is going to march to Bristol. He then sends orders to the armies to muster in Bristol, to break down the bridge at Keynsham, and orders Faversham with the main Royal Army to march west to Bath. At the same time, Churchill is ordered to block Monmouth's route to Bristol. Now, what I find fascinating, and it's an area of interest for me in the future, is where did that word come from? Because certainly at this point, Monmouth is still talking about marching on London, which he does. He then marches north through Glastonbury in the rain, finally reaching on 23rd of June, Shepton Mallet. Now, this is an interesting junction for me because, as you can see, Churchill has been outmaneuvered. He's at Somerton, where he's joined by the artillery and the rest of the foot brigades, the two Tangiers battalions, as people like to call them. He also, about now, receives word through the newspapers, in fact, and through spies and agents, that Faversham is on his way from London. He has intelligence from Bristol that the militia, although they're there, aren't there in strength. And he knows that the militia that was in Wales has been pushed back to Bath. So all in all, he's now sort of surrounded, but if he advances now on London, he doesn't know what it's going to bump into. He knows a superior army of probably about 2,000 guards and cavalry are marching from London. And he knows, because of the, again, reports and the letters and other things, that Churchill is behind him with about 500 infantry and about 300 cavalry and the artillery. So should he advance right now on London, knowing there's an army in his rear and an army in his front? Or should he march north to Keynsham on the best advice, because that's actually the easiest route to Bristol? If you know anyone knows Bristol, you go south across the Avon, you've got to cross the Avon to get into the city. If you go across Keynsham and attack from the north, Bristol was unfortified at that time, you stand a better chance of taking the city, especially from the militia. So based upon the advice and the Army Council meeting, they decide they should march north to Keynsham. Yes, he does not know that actually Faversham has advanced at post-haste with the cavalry of the army to Bristol at this point. He doesn't know that. So he reaches Keynsham, and there is a skirmish at Keynsham, and it's at Keynsham that his army is estimated to be 10,000 strong. That Oglethorpe's cavalry patrol does stumble into Monmouth's rearguard, and there is an aggressive action. They capture some of the horse grenadiers who are in Oglethorpe's cavalry from Faversham's army. And there they learn that Faversham is in Bristol. And they learn that the intelligence those spies give them is that there's over 5,000 men in Bristol. The assumption has to be that it's the whole Royal Army under Faversham is actually in Bristol. They know that Churchill is in their rear, who's moved to Pensford on that night. Against popular belief, on the same day as this happens, in Frome, there is actually an uprising. Over 2,000 men, local men, have mustered from Wiltshire and across North Somerset into Frome, where the town has declared for Monmouth. So at the same time as Monmouth at Keynsham, there is an uprising, and there is a messenger sent from Frome to Monmouth that he receives that evening. What he doesn't know is that the Wiltshire militia put down that uprising almost as soon as it happens while marching from Westbury and attacking Frome. The men at Frome they are unequipped. And that's one of the big misconceptions. The uprising in Frome is often talked about as being Monmouth's army. It's not. It's an uprising. Monmouth's army at this stage is further north in Keynsham. So when you look at it, Faversham and Churchill, the two main royal armies, are actually behind him. He's now got a clear road, in theory, other than the militia, to march to London. Now, what he doesn't want to do is go along the northern road, which takes you through Reading, etc., because that road is full of, there are lots of militia, and they would be marching south to cut that road off. So his plan is to go via Frome, via Warminster, bypassing across the Salisbury Plain to London, where there is a planned uprising, and Colonel Manley has already gone there to help encourage Colonel Danvers to rise up in London. So he marches south, bypassing Bath, and reaches Norton St. Philip on the 27th. Faversham, in the meantime, has ordered all his men to muster in Bath. So if you look at the map, yes, there are some militia units scattered around, but the royal forces, the Wiltshire militia, the Somerset militia, the Gloucestershire militia, who actually most of them stay in Bristol, the Grafton's guard cavalry, and all of Churchill's men all muster in Bath on the night of the 26th. On the morning of the 27th, Faversham deploys his whole army and sends out an advance guard under his Monmouth's brother, Grafton, and they attack Monmouth at Norton St. Philip. It's a planned attack. Faversham plans that attack. He is with the advance guard, and it is not a mere skirmish. It involves into a major combat between the two armies. Estimated casualties around about 100, 150 men on the Royal Army alone. The horse grenadiers that took part in this Keynsham skirmish are heavily engaged. And most of the troops, when you look at the equipment lists that come out of the War Office, they've lost most of their equipment at Keynsham. They have to be re-equipped after the campaign. So it's a major battle. It's not a mere skirmish. After that, Monmouth is basically delayed. And what that Faversham has done is although he loses the battle, he withdraws to Bradford upon Avon. Monmouth is forced to march in the rain to Frome. His men have now been on the road for a good period of time, 7-8 days, without much rest. They fought a major battle. Then the Wade's regiment did not march out of Norton St. Philip until 11 o'clock at night, arriving in Frome in the really early hours of the morning. His men are totally exhausted when they get to Frome. This is the other thing that people tend to forget, is that all great plans go out the window when you make contact with the enemy, and General Jack recognizes that. And what happens over the next couple of days is actually Faversham has intelligence. Oglethorpe is going in, and there's a particular account that talks about Oglethorpe basically going to Norton St. Philip, where he meets up with people who tell him of Monmouth's plans. Monmouth's plan is still to march Warminster, and in actual fact, in the early on the 30th of June, he starts towards Warminster. But Faversham has had 4 advance warning and has moved his men, his whole army, to Westbury. Now, anybody that knows that area knows that Westbury and Warminster are fairly close together. And Monmouth, again, would have been totally exposed on his flank and his rear if he tried to do that maneuver. The other thing is Monmouth has now run out of money. Now, against popular belief, Monmouth does actually pay for his equipment and his food and his men. And it's recorded, again, after the events, that by this stage, because of Dare dying, who was the primary fundraiser, he got £500 out of Prothero down in the West Country, as Jack mentioned. But what happens is they're running out of men and money. The road to London has gone. The general pardon has come out from the king. So rather than retreating back to Bridgewater, he's got nowhere to go. He goes back there because it's where his men are safe. He's got a good supply. He's got good support. But also on the way, he can go via Wells, where he picks up more equipment left by Kirk and his regiment. They leave all their new equipment they've had issued to them from the Tower Armories. So Monmouth retreats back to Bridgewater. But Faversham does not follow him up on his coattails. Faversham writes back after Norton St. Philip that he will not advance into contact with Monmouth until he has received tents, because he needs tents. If he doesn't have tents, his men have to sleep in the villages, and that is exposing his men to Monmouth's brisk actions. So Faversham is aware of Monmouth's abilities. He's not, if you like, just following him around and against whatever Churchill said. Faversham is being very careful and cautious. All his manoeuvres over the next few days are to block the roads to London. Every manoeuvre he does is making sure that he stays between Monmouth and London. So by the 4th of July, we have Monmouth in Bridgewater. We have Faversham at Somerton. In between them is the Wiltshire Militia, based at Middlezoy. Now, this is really interesting because what Faversham has done is he's using the militia effectively as a buffer, because it's not until the 2nd or 3rd of July that Faversham gets the tents that he needs to deploy properly. Meanwhile, Monmouth has been exercising his men, drilling his men, they barricaded and roughly fortified Bridgewater. But what they've actually done is they've recuperated. They've also got rid of a lot of the dead wood that may have gathered in the army over the past weeks. What they're left with is that core of an army of around about 4,000 men, as General Jack mentioned. Monmouth's patrol radius, because of the Middlezoy, is limited. Although he knows Faversham's in Somerton, he's limited perspective and radius. The other thing he's looking at is his ways, his routes, as Jack mentioned. how can he then cut through ultimately to London or Bristol via what's called Daniel Defoe, later called in his tour of England, the upper way, which goes across the Poldens and then through Wales, or the lower way, which Daniel Defoe, 20 years after the battle, describes as marshy, boggy, and high risk. It's a single track road that goes over the Poldens and across to Axbridge, to Bristol, which is actually Monmouth's choice. He then decides that's the route he will take. And on the morning of the 5th of July, he's planning to take that route. What's cunning about Faversham's move to Somerton is effectively from that position, he can block the London road. He can't stop the Bristol road, but he can stop the London road. So effectively, Monmouth is forced into one option, which is to march to Bristol. So day 38, I'm going to cover this because this is really what kicked me off on Fighting for Liberty's journey 20 years ago, was that ambling around Somerset, because people orientate around what they know. And we know of a different landscape to what Monmouth had to live with. So the A38 would be the normal route, and it would sort of go straight up north to Bristol, or not quite so out. Anybody who lives around that way will know there's a few bottlenecks, mainly called the M5. But anyway, that road is there today. However, what there was in 1677 was a large oxbow lake that was cut in 1677. It's about a mile in depth, and it cuts into, in fact, almost towards Bordrip, and I'll show that in more detail in a moment. That's a large obstacle, which is why there's no roads that cut through that way to the south of the hills. And by 1685, only sort of 7 years later, there would have still been quite a large marshy area with lots of little small ponds. In fact, you can still see it if you look closely on any map today. So that's blocking if you like, the route that we'd normally think of. The other thing that we tend to forget about Bridgewater is it was a seaport. It was a seaport, and all these maneuvers that this map shows is all about keeping the seaport open, dredging it, making sure it's clear of silt as easy as possible. They reckon when they did the cut, it saved over an hour of traveling to Bridgewater. So there was actually a key at Bridgewater. There were seagoing vessels, and in fact, after the campaign, some of the men that were sent to the West Indies as indentured servants or slaves, as we like to call them, actually left from Bridgewater by boat. So it's not insignificant reason to go to Bridgewater from Monmouth's perspective. He has a route out if necessary, but also there are supplies, there's food and provisions there. This map is from 1660. It's taken from ones that are found in the museum at Taunton. And over there on the left, you can see the dumbbell chiz, which is where some of the waterways that surround the Great Sedgemoor flow into. And you can see there that that Dumble, the cut, what impact that has on the roads. And that's where I start to deviate quite dramatically from some of the maps you saw earlier, in that Knoll Hill is not really on the junction of that road. It's on the edge of that junction. And that has a big bearing on all the future accounts. The second thing is that you can see there the two different ways, the upper way and lower way, and how they skirt. But there are also a lot of minor tracks that go through to Bristol across the moor. One goes through Chedzoy, Bower. So lots of routes across that it's not just as clean cut as you might think. The other thing we can look at is Faversham then on the morning of the 5th of July. Now he has tents, sends his quartermaster general and his adjutant general out to scout the land. And they pick Western Zoyland as the best place to establish a camp. And that's where they march to. They leave the militia at Middle Zoy and they reach Western Zoyland in the early afternoon. But the adjutant general with the quartermaster and the probably Compton's cavalry patrol and 2 squadrons and a troop of dragoons arrive in the early, if you like, late morning. And that's what Monmouth sees. He can see those men arriving. He knows what's coming. He knows that the army is marching there. And that creates a problem for Monmouth, as General Jack mentioned. And this is where we totally align, in that by Faversham marching to Western Zoyland and establishing his camp there, he's effectively cut off Monmouth's route to Bristol or to London. Very strategic position. And Faversham actually is talking about attacking Bridgewater the next day. And there are some accounts that say he sent an envoy to Bridgewater that day to summons it to surrender. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. That's only one piece of evidence there. What is clear is that Monmouth at this point changes his plans and sees that he has one option, and that is really to neutralize the enemy and then try and break out. And that's his plan, is to send his baggage. And in fact, his baggage do get as far as almost across the moors to Axbridge, before they're captured. So he sends his baggage out, and then he just decides he needs to do something about Faversham. It's more of a holding action, disruption. Before I go into that, though, I want to go into one of the other things that General Jack mentioned. And that's around the common myth that Monmouth's army was a bunch of peasants armed with pitchforks. And that's a bit of a derogatory, but I've seen that written in some books. What is really clear, and these are all quotes, and not quotes from Monmouth. These are quotes from spies in the government army and the government pay in Holland, while Monmouth is recruiting and Argyle's recruiting their men, and they're buying equipment. And Monmouth does not buy just matchlock muskets. He's actually equipping his men with caseloads of the latest flintlock muskets. But more importantly, he's making uniforms, and uniforms make an army. There's been a lot of dispute whether it's a red and purple or purple and red. However, when I went to the archives, I found this quote, which was a man who actually gets captured in Taunton a week before Monmouth arrives, who's responsible for making the purple coats lined with red. When Monmouth lands, all his officers are wearing purple. They have brought a large quantity of purple coats to equip his army with. This is not going to be, he's a general, he's a commander, he knows he needs an army. He buys purple coats. The other misconception is, alongside the coats, you need colours. Colours are what define a regiment or a battalion. All his colours, except probably one, were all made in Holland before he lands in England. That means he's defined what his army structure is going to be like, how many men are going to be in each company, how many officers are going to be in each company, the number of companies in each battalion or regiment. That's all been defined. That modelling has been pre-established, and he issues his commissions to his officers on the boat. But a lot of men come from London or from other parts of the country with commissions and take up regiments. For example, Colonel Bovitt, who is not in Holland, he's in the West Country with a commission to raise the men of Taunton. There are lots of agents' reports and spy reports about Monmouth's men buying caseloads of equipment. Some of it came from army surplus in Spanish Flanders, but a lot of it actually was acquired from manufacturers in Amsterdam. And there are accounts of that. So they're buying the equipment they need to arm the model army they're creating. What's really amazing was when I found that references, a lot of references, in fact, to Monmouth's buying up the latest technology, quad-barreled pistols, double-barreled carbines. And what's then fascinating is there's an account of the cavalry action at Ashiel on the government side. And one of the references is that the royal troopers talk about all Monmouth cavalry being equipped with armor, armed with carbines and quad-barreled and double-barreled pistols and carbines. So not only did they buy it, they also used it. So this is not a rabble army. This is actually, they have to resort to using equipment, and I might touch on that later, but it's not a rabble army. And almost certainly Monmouth brought enough equipment and arms to form the core of an army of about 5,000 men. There are also spy reports that talk about Monmouth shipping in pistols and rifle and firearms, flintlocks and muskets, etc., through London and traveling them out to Chester, which was going to be a point of uprising, but also to the West Country. And why this is fascinating is the man that bought the purple coats and is referenced with the colours is the man that went to Taunton a week before the rising. Now, he's a merchant. He's never been stopped. What else was he carrying? Interesting question. I'm just highlighting one other thing. All these dates are not after the campaign. They're not after Monmouth's battle. They are while Monmouth ultimately is still in Amsterdam, or just after Monmouth has left Amsterdam. when they do a investigation into what actually has happened. And there's a lot of really great evidence out there to say that Monmouth and Argyll bought massive amounts of equipment to support their armies. You've seen this slide earlier about the Royal Army, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit because there's a bit of an interesting one, which is I'm going to focus on the foot. Down here, we talk about 1,900 foot in the government army. And that's sort of supported by evidence. And this is a quote from a letter that talks about 1,800 foot marching out of London under Lord Faversham. So that equates, if you like, to that number that you see in all these accounts of the Royal Army being about that strong. There's another quote. This is actually from the London Gazette. So this is what is published in the newspapers. Is that the Duke of Grafton marched out of London with 2,000 of His Majesty's foot guards. This is not the cavalry or the troops of horse. This is just the infantry. So we've got about 2,000 foot guards, which we know end up at the battle, or 1,800. That's been conservative. What we're forgetting is Lord Churchill's brigade, which at the Battle of Sedgemoor, when it marches to Bridgewater and then effectively occupies the West Country, is estimated at 500 foot. So let's look at this. There's 500 foot. The other thing that's missing from these government numbers that everybody talks about is Dumbarton's, actually incorrectly named Dumbarton's. It's actually the Royal Regiment of Foot under Lieutenant Colonel Douglas. On the 13th of June, they are ordered to increase the numbers of every single company, as is the Foot Guards, in fact, to 100 men. They've got 6 companies at St. Catherine's and more companies in Southwark of this regiment. And we know they recruited beyond their core standard size of 50, because after the campaign, they're ordered to disband all those men that recruited in London. Any Englishman needs to be taken out of the ranks effectively. So we know they increased beyond their 50, possibly to 100, possibly not quite 100, but we know what would have happened when they had these orders is Grafton didn't march for a whole battalion. Trelawney's regiments did not march out of Portsmouth with all their men. They took men to increase the size from the core of the regiments into the battalions. So ultimately, there's another 500 men. So 500 for the Dumbartons, I'd like to call them, 500 from Churchill's brigade, 1,800 from the Foot Guards. That to me is more like 2,800 foot. And that puts Monmouth's army and Faversham's army extremely close on numbers if you exclude the Wiltshire militia. Faversham has about 6 battalions of foot, about 5 squadrons of horse, and the squadron is 2 or 3 troops, about 100, 120 men, possibly 150, depending on the size of the units and the campaign. Monmouth has 6 battalions of foot and only 4 squadrons of horse. He's actually sent 2 troops off to Minehead, and another troop actually off to Keynsham. So he's under strength. But yes, Monmouth has less artillery, more infantry than the government army. So I'm sort of conscious of time a little bit. So I'm going to quickly just to go through the government camp, because this is where me and General Jack are very closely aligned, because the government army was well structured. The Adjutant General arrived, he set up the camp, the Quartermaster General then laid out the camp, and the armies then formed up. What I'm going to do is go into a little bit more detail around the battlefield to explain orientation a little bit. Because one of the other things that you'll learn as I go through this is the Black Ditch was not where people portray the Black Ditch to be. This map is from 1780s, before the King Sedgemoor drain was made or built. And you can see what's called the Rowing Lake, and that's actually what's now the Bussex Marine. And you can see the arrow showing it flowing from the right, which is the top right, which is the Black Ditch. I'm going to highlight three points in the landscape. We've got the Black Ditch Bussex Rhine Junction. We've got Mount Close Batch, which we've already seen. Entrance to Fowler's Plot. So remember, this is 1780, 100 years after the battle. This is a plan that was done just after the campaign, just after the battle. And again, we can see those 3 key areas, those three junctions in the landscape. We can also see the upper and lower Pludgeon. And this is an area that I'm going to talk about in more detail in a few minutes. But these are the key areas, the things we need to think about of where we look at any map orientations that going on. This is Dummer's map, probably done around about 1686, a year after the campaign, the battle. And it shows, this is about his perspective about 1:30 in the morning. And it shows again, roughly those three landscape pieces in there. And I'll come back to this map, this plan later. What it does show, and why I was really fascinated by this, was actually there is footpaths indicated on it. It clearly shows the upper plungeon, and it shows a path going across the Bussocks about there on the map, which is actually further around than we tend to think of. And then we'll look at that in more detail later. It also shows the army camp. So what I've done, what I then did for Fighting for Liberty is I took all that information, overlaid it on modern OS maps, downloaded it, layered it with historical OS maps, and then created with sort of survey maps and satellites and stuff. I then overlaid all the key features. And what I've got here is those three things in the landscape, together with where the Greater Guard, which was the beyond the camp, about half a mile to 3/4 of a mile from the camp, the Adjutant General laid out and placed the cavalry in what's called a Greater Guard in terms of the historical sites at the time, military sites at the time. There's the government camp, and there's the upper and lower plunge. Now, what is also missing from all these maps, which is still there in part today, is down at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the Halsam Rhine. And there are, as you'll see later, that is clearly defined on that period map of 1780, that crossing across the Sutton. When you look at Compton's patrol, Uppercut's patrol, and certainly Faversham did do a circuit at night, according to one of the accounts. When you look at where these patrols are, they are covering the upper plungeon, they're covering the main roads. They're well placed to cover the flanks of the army. In fact, Compton's is called the right flank of the Royal Army. That's where it's positioned. And Compton has 2 troops of horse and a troop of dragoons with him, about 150 men. When we pair that back and then look at this in the modern landscape, you can clearly see the King Sedgemoor drain cutting between, if you like, Western Zoyland and the Black Ditch. Let's have a quick look at the camp. So this is a Dummer's picture of the camp. And what it's made up of is regimented blocks of tents. This is for Sackville's battalion, or the Coldstream Guards, as they're common called today. And each company has a file of tents. It's very well structured. And this is written down in all the military manuals. This is what officers did day in, day out. And the Quartermaster General would have laid this out, and then the regimental quartermasters would have then erected the tents and with the men. There are no fires below the upper way. So to the left of the screen is the Bussocks Reen, and the tents for the lodgement, which where the sutlers and the camp kitchens are, and the wagons and all the other bits and pieces needed. And there are no fires allowed below the upper byway. At the end of the upper byway is where the sergeants sleep. At the end where the weapons are where your file leaders and your, if you like, your corporals sleep, and the drummers, so they can come out and rally out and do the drums. It's very well organized. When the alarm is raised, the men will then come out of their tents. They'll file down the lane to where the weapons are, filter around the officers, where the lodgement, where the captain and the lieutenant will be up and ready. But the first men out there are actually the file leaders, and in Dumbarton's regiment and Trelawney's and Kirk's, they're actually armed with firelocks, whereas the Bog, the musketeers, are armed with matchlocks. So they form up there, and it takes around about 15 minutes for a company to form from that position. While they're doing that, the sergeants and other people are making sure the ranks are in place. The captains are checking everything out. The corporals and the lance espados and the file leaders are making sure all the men have got match or they've got their equipment ready. So about after 15 minutes, the battalion would have formed. But then what's happened in terms of the companies? Then what has to happen is the companies have to form battalion line. And that means the outside pikemen on the far right, if you like, at the top of the picture, have to march to the center. The pikemen at the bottom of the picture have to march to the center upwards to form a battalion. And that again takes around about 5 minutes to do that maneuver. So possibly 20 to 25 minutes, the Royal Army is formed out of their camp. It's designed to be that way. And Monmouth knows that's how an army works. Faversham knows that's how the army works. Churchill knows. The other thing that's the powerful thing about the camp is you know the size of it. Every company has a file of tents. If there are more than 50 men in the company, it has 2 rows of tents in that file. If it's 1, it has 1. So Kirk's, who only have 50 men companies, effectively only have 2 files of tents. They only have 4 companies. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that. Trelawney's only have 4 companies, and the Grenadiers have moved off, so they have 3, but they're 100-man companies. So you can work out roughly what the frontage of that campsite looks like. And then also around them is the drawing up space, and that has to be 100 paces wide around them so they can form up properly. Because when the alarm is raised, they have to form into line of battle. Kirks and Trelawney's are actually small regiment battalions. The rest are nearly full strength, so it's difficult to say what sizes were. And that's roughly the alignment you'd get. It could be slightly round that way or that way, but that's the size. So actually quite a large area, with or without the government, the estimations of 1,800 men. The Guards still take up the same space. Next one is Monmouth never knew about the Russex Rhine, and this one is really telling. Because when Monmouth was captured, he wrote this account, or he didn't write it. He was asked about it, and someone wrote it down for him. He stated that they made little portable bridges to use to cross over the sloughs and cuts and gutters. He also states that the government camp lay on the other side of the gutter. He knows about the Bussex Rhine. What's interesting is they're making portable bridges so the infantry can cross using the bridges, while the cavalry use the fords to cut through. Because, as General Jackson mentioned, as they march down towards the battlefield, the cavalry take the lead, because their job is to get into the camp, and we'll come on that in a minute. So Monmouth knows about it. They build little bridges to cross quickly across the main gutters, or the reams as we call them today. I've orientated the map around a little bit, so Bridgewater is now on your left, or where it says north. And this is the modern map, and it shows the cutout of the battlefield. It shows those 3 key points. And this is then that 1780 map that shows, if you like, the battle at the field roughly as it looked like at the time of the battle. And again, towards Bridgewater, we have Peasy Pond, which is actually a part of the drainage system for the moor at the time. We have the Black Ditch, which runs sort of in the middle. And then we have Western Zoyland on the right of the map, and Chedzoy Mill. Those are the 3 points I talk about quite a lot. And again, I've now overlaid that with the sort of more modern, if you like, the sort of construct of an OS map. We can see those 3 points. And we know the camp is roughly in that location. So Monmouth's camp plan is effectively this. As General Jack mentioned, it's to advance at speed, if you like, at night, across the moor. The infantry are to hold in place while the cavalry go through the camp, causing chaos out the other side. And then the infantry are covering that, withdraw effectively back, because the wagons have been ordered to Bristol on the border and across the moors towards Axbridge. So this is very much a beating up, as we'd like to call it, of the royal camp, cause as much chaos and destruction and chaos and casualties as possible, and then retreat behind the shield of the infantry off the battlefield. However, when we look at the royal deployments, and I'll touch a little bit on Oglethorpe, because there's no way Oglethorpe can be on Knoll Hill. If he's on Knoll Hill, he's going to travel when he goes to Bridgewater straight through Monmouth's army. And there's also reported around midnight, he's in Chedzoy, and he takes the middle road to Bridgewater. He doesn't go down the same road as Monmouth. So the only way that he can have done that is if he's covering the Bristol roads. And remember, the roads across Wales, there's lots of roads and tracks, is to go up north to the Poldens, then back down to Pendon Hill, and from there to Chedzoy, from there to Bridgewater. So Monmouth does leave. The baggage leaves first. They set off earlier, follows up with his infantry, as Jack mentioned, quite a long column. So Monmouth then marches through to get there. If you look where the cavalry patrols and the vedettes and the scouts of the forces are, he's going to go straight through Compton's men. And that's where we touch on now the traitor shot, because as Jack mentioned, I don't think it's a traitor. I don't think it's a misfire. It's a vedette. It's one of the pickets who are out there that is checked by Faversham after Oglethorpe's gone. And Faversham's account talks clearly about that maneuver. So Hucker, with the cavalry, arrives at the Longmoor Stones, where the crossing is, at about the middle, according to that period map. The cavalry have to cross that defile, and there are pickets, and we'll look at an aerial photograph, a photograph of that area in a minute. There are pickets in that space. It's easy enough for them to spot the cavalry, and so they make a lot of noise once they get in as they maneuver. It's clearly them that made the warning shot. And they ride back to Compton, who's sitting out on the right flank. It takes some time for men to defile across, and my timing is slightly different to General Jack's because I've tried to build up a detailed plan of how and where the units could be to align with Dummer's account. So we know Hucker crosses, and he has to file his men across and redeploy into troops, into a column, into a line, sorry. And Compton mounts his men up and advances towards the enemy. Meanwhile, the warning is slowly making its way to the camp. About 1:30, according to Dummer, the main account, between 1:30 and 2 o'clock. I've taken 1:30 as the trigger point. There's a cavalry skirmish out on the far flank, caused by Compton hitting Hucker and breaking Hucker. Hucker's troop of squadron effectively then routes back into the oncoming cavalry, causing chaos behind them. Meanwhile, Monmouth is then marching, and first that warning shot goes, he advances at all pace, taking his men across the little bridges they've made to get onto the battlefield as quickly as possible. This is Dummer's map. And again, you can see that cavalry skirmish going on the far right of the picture, and Monmouth's men marching down the centre. On the right, you can see Oglethorpe returning from Bridgewater. This photograph is taken from Sutton Mill, which overlooks the whole battlefield, in fact. But this is now looking toward Chedzoy's church. It shows the black ditch in the foreground. It shows the black line where the King Sedgemoor drain is today. And it shows Mount Close Batch. So effectively, this is the area that the scouts would have been covering. But it's also the area where Compton's cavalry patrol and squadron, would have been placed. As they advanced, there would have been clash would have happened somewhere in this area. It's hard to tell, and no real research has been done into that particular area. So we look at that from a headline perspective, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to whiz this through a little bit further, is that we see that the Compton clash happens in this area. Now the warnings arrived about 1:30, 1:45, possibly, I think 1:30. The warning arrives in the camp. Monmouth has got to get across the battlefield. What I'm going to quickly take you through is what happens when you move the black ditch to where the King Sedgemoor drain is. You shift that point on the maps, and therefore you have to shift the upper plungin and the lower plungin around and reorientate the government camp. You also have to move the cavalry patrol to a different location. And what we end up with then, with Compton's men blocking Monmouth's foot and the cavalry, which in my mind would mean that Monmouth would not have made it to the battle because his men would also have been broken by the cavalry as they routed back. Some of the units are disrupted in that column that goes back a mile by the cavalry, but on the whole, Monmouth gets his advanced units across and down the battlefield. So when we take the black ditch out, but put it back to where it should be, Compton has more space, and therefore there's more room for Monmouth to maneuver. And that cavalry skirmish definitely happened. So Monmouth now presses his men forward. He talks about this. He says he rushes the battlefield within 100 musket shots of our forces, is where the camp is. He advances at speed. He has to cover about a 3/4 of a mile or 1,200 paces in 20 minutes. That's a tall order. His men are in column. He's got to deploy into battle line. So can he get there within 20 minutes? Because that's how long it's going to take for the government army to form up. The next myth I'm going to quickly cover is Churchill's part in this. Most accounts give Churchill the winning praise for the battle by moving Kirk, as you might have heard. Everybody else, all the eyewitness accounts talk about the cavalry being the fait accompli for the battle. So as we go through this, around about 2 o'clock, Monmouth's marching across the battlefield. Lord Grey does miss the upper plungeon. He's gone off, he's rushed ahead. His guide is probably lost in the rout of Hooker. Jones is behind, running his squadron and troop across the field. Monmouth's running across the battlefield. Grey then does go across the front of the battle line. Oglethorpe returns. Jones and Brand bring the rear guard forward while Monmouth deploys into line. About 2:30, Monmouth is deployed in line facing the government army, and slowly the units are filtering in position. Jones then starts to move towards the upper plungeon. Grey attacks the lower plungeon, where he's effectively hit by Oglethorpe. As General Jack mentioned, this is a photograph of looking from the Whig Army's position towards the government camp. Douglas's St. Mary's Church is sort of that middle, it's behind some of the hedge. Grafton's the foot guards, and Eton's. So this is what would have faced Monmouth's units at about 2:30 in the morning. Again, if all they were doing was holding their ground, it's fine. But Monmouth now orders them to press forward and attack the government camp because of the loss of his cavalry. This is the same view looking towards the monument. You can see the government line, if you like, is just beyond the trees on the left. Monmouth's line is about where the hedge line is, and the monument is smack in the middle of this. So as you move forward, as we progress, Jones is on the right of the picture. He then attacks the cavalry, and in fact, he breaks them. But on the right, Oglethorpe breaks Grey. Meanwhile, the battle line is being deployed. Holmes brings his men forward. There's a general engagement with the artillery, etc., as General Jack mentioned. And Cornby dismounts under orders of Faversham, his dragoons, to face Holmes. There's a general engagement. Kirk is then moved across to the flank. Grey rallies some troops. Jones is broken. And we then see the cavalry starting to sweep round the wings. Oglethorpe attacks Brant, and there's an account of him doing that, but is broken, and he withdraws. But the wing is now exposed. There's a lot of cavalry that are on that far flank. The bulk of the Royal Army's cavalry is out on the wing on the eastern side of the battlefield. This map is again from Dummer, and it shows that right dramatically. You can see the weight of the cavalry. And Faversham has deliberately done this, deployed bulk of his cavalry on the flank to attack Monmouth. We then roll forward. The cavalry are strengthened. But quickly, let's just go back to General Jack's map, because that realigned, that had the alignment based upon the King Sedgemoor drain. So we need to move everything across and shift the whole battle across to these locations. And that then perfectly overlays with David Chandler's map, which we were using earlier, and shows roughly these positions. The whole thing has been squashed. The whole battlefield has been squashed down. The unit sizes are dramatically shrunken. It just does not make sense. But this is the general perspective of the battle. The whole area is outbalanced by using the King Sedgemoor drain as the Black Ditch. So as we progress, at 4 o'clock-ish, certainly Monmouth's already started his withdrawal. The cavalry hits, and anybody who knows anything about 7th century warfare, trying to withdraw, it started to get light. Faversham talks about the pikemen wavering. Douglas's, or Dumbartons, we like to call them, cross the ditch. The Grenadiers are ordered forward across the ditch, the Bussex Reen. The cavalry are pressurizing the flanks. Monmouth is withdrawing. He's ordered a withdrawal. And effectively what happens is they break. And the Holmes's regiment, Bovett's Blue Regiment, Brant's men, the artillery is captured. Effectively, it's a general rout. But the folks, Matthews and Wade, are far enough, Matthews being in the middle, have had a chance to withdraw in some sort of good order. And this is Dummer's view of the map, of the perspective. You can see the cavalry and the dragoons in the middle. And what I highlight is the bottom. That's Kirk's brigade, not even engaged in the battle. Kirk has a very few casualties sustained, and those are probably sustained at the lower plunge and early in the battle, not later in the battle. There's another telling thing, which is that Kirks are armed with matchlocks. They're also armed with they have bandoliers, which effectively hold the powder. So that it's the reason that I'm bringing that up is I'm going to cover that later, but that's effectively the same way as Monmouth's men are equipped. The final one I'm going to quickly cover off is Monmouth fled halfway through the battle, now leaving his men to die. Now, a lot of people use this against Monmouth. He was a coward. He betrayed his men. He should have charged in and died like a glorious hero, unlike James, of course, who ran away in 1688. But what his account indicates is that he talks about fighting along a lane towards Bridgewater. And that exactly matches what General Faversham talks about, and the fact that Monmouth withdraws, and he does not want to follow up Monmouth because he's frightened of an ambush. And Colonel Wade also talks about withdrawing through the lane. So if Monmouth is there, how can he run away halfway through the battle? Because that lane is what we see there leading up towards Chedzoy. Matthews and folks are coming across. The Wiltshire militia have arrived, and the cavalry arrived quite early, and they're part of the force that sweep around the wing to break Monmouth's army. It's only now that the guards start to advance. The grenadiers have advanced. It's primarily horse grenadiers, and the grenadiers now press Wade and the cavalry. Here's a quick view of that with the lane to Bridgewater on the left, Mount Close Batch in the far distance, Langmoor Rhine, and similar to what you saw earlier, and then what we seem to call Wade's last stand. If you take it from the government perspective, Monmouth would be about where those cows are. No pun intended. That's the road towards Bridgewater. That's the lane. This is what the Royal Army would have probably seen as they marched towards it. They'd have seen the Whig army reformed across that ridgeline. And that's why Faversham says he fears an ambush. And he treads very carefully. He sends units across the Langmoor in a cautious way with the grenadiers, etc. So what happens is a rolling retreat as Wade and the Whig army would retreat up the lane. Certainly Folkes and Matthews, who escaped the campaign and return in 1688, by the way. So if they're in the center of the battlefield or cut off, then if they didn't do this, they would be dead. So then they're not. What we see is about this point, it's probably when Monmouth left. Towards the very end, when the battle's over, he can see his men are doing a fighting withdrawal. Is when he leaves, and he's probably persuaded to leave, because if he dies, the whole Whig movement's ambitions die with him. So he's persuaded to leave right at the end of the battle, as we then look at the final retreat up the lanes. They probably went on all the way through Chedzoy and back towards Bridgewater. But at this point, Faversham does not press the army. When we look at that in the wider perspective, we can see at the top of the picture, you've got Jones, who's broken near the upper plungeon. And interesting enough, he and most of his officers get to London quite quickly after the battle. In fact, a lot of the escapees end up in London. Folkes, Matthews and Wade, their units are in these fields, and they have these escape routes. They can withdraw back through Chedzoy, which is why it's so important, where there's probably a lot of follow-on activity in terms of holding the ground, and while they retreat off, they can then go off to Wales, they can go towards Bristol. And in fact, that's the way Monmouth goes, through Balderip, as does other people like Captain Kidd, who was captured near Warminster with 50 troopers. Others, like Wade, retreat into Bridgewater with 300 men. It's not quite as all up as we like to think. So, I've got 5 minutes, crikey. So Monmouth's attempts a rapid advance, actually it was the government counter manoeuvres that stopped him getting to London, not his dillying around. It was the enemy's positioning. Monmouth modelled and equipped his army. Yes, they were raw, and they were still cut raw at the edges by Sedgemoor, but they were trained by regular officers. They had regular NCOs. They had regular equipment, in fact, better equipment than the government army in some cases. They were just beaten. Faversham was advanced into contact. He did not move into contact until he had tents. He after Norton St. Philip, he was wary of advancing. What he did, though, he did deploy, as was the military art of the time, a greater guard covering the whole of the battlefield. Monmouth bought those little bridges. He knew about the Reens. He wrote about the Reens. The Great Guard did their job. They fired the warning shot, and effectively, you could say that's what won the battle for the government army. It was the flanking attack ordered by Faversham that actually won the final event. That was the fait accompli that's what destroyed Monmouth's cohesion. And certainly, without a doubt, for Monmouth to say about the lane, he was in the lane as the army retreated at the very end of the battle. All that I said is in my book, and I'm saying thank you. I'm really short about the time. We've got a really short bit of time for the discussion and questions, so thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jack. Indeed, we are pretty much out of time, but I don't think we could have cut it short, so it took as long as it took. Thank you both. Jack, if you wouldn't mind unmuting your microphone. I think we should, it's only right if I think we give you a right to reply to Steve as our, can I say, our expert witness, and to, you know, in a minute or two to sum up, if that's at all possible, your initial thoughts. I know this requires probably a lot more thought, but are there any points that stand out for you?
I was fascinated. I mean, I think Steve has done the most extraordinary amount of work there, certainly more than I've done by many 100%, and I commend him for it. I'm delighted, really. I think maybe I'm fooling myself that I have not been the peddler of some of the myths that he has mentioned, because actually I found myself at no stage did I find myself saying, no, that's rubbish. No, I don't care what he's read or what that's not what happened. And in fact, I found it illuminating. I think what I am very pleased about is that this has been raised to a level of debate where it is accepted that both armies, although from very different bases, both armies were sophisticated and well equipped and knew their job, and the officers and the non-commissioned officers particularly. It's this level of sophistication, the level of planning. It's so often these battles are portrayed as chaotic, which all battles are, and that the officers are indolent and lazy and incompetent and really don't understand the nature of what they're doing. And I think what Steve has done in particular has undermined that prejudice. What I did find fascinating was that he went further than me by saying that this intended to be not just an action which enabled Monmouth to get away, but that the infantry, Monmouth's infantry, were there to cover the cavalry withdrawal. And I think that is a very interesting a very interesting reflection, and I would like to be able to go away and reflect on that myself, because I think he has probably got something there, and that may have been part of the reason why they were so reluctant to advance, not because they lacked the confidence, but because this was not part of the plan. And therefore they were hesitant, because in fact they had been given clear orders. They knew what they were supposed to be doing. And I find that very interesting. So I think in the short time we've got, and I'd also like to commend him for re-establishing Feversham's reputation, because every time I look at this, Feversham comes out as a thoughtful. He may not have been very dynamic. Half his brain was missing because of a fire, but he is a thoughtful and perceptive commander, and it would do a lot of us. It would have done a lot of us to have studied people like Feversham rather more clearly, rather more carefully.
Thank you very much, both of you. So I'm going to move us on very swiftly towards the end. Mark, I think you've got some discussions, perhaps just a couple of slides on, if we could jump ahead a little bit maybe, of what's been going on in and around Chedzoy. I think this leads really well. The line of retreat, the organised retreat, and what we've been finding in and around the village. I think we're going to have to come back to that at some point in the future. Maybe we need a follow up to look at the retreat and what happened next.
I was going to say, yeah. I was going to say, I think it will warrant a follow up for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And so therefore, can we just talk about the future, Mark? What have we got in the pipeline for plans for the future?
Okay. Well, I mean, just 20 seconds really. I mean, what we've looked at, we've seen the two markers from Steve's maps, which is the entrance to Fowler's Blot and Mount Batch for those who live around here will know this area, will know this is a modern map. And I've just reiterated by a big arrow, that's that retreat path, and that's always been a great fascination to us, because I think over the years, we know through people that have found things, pistol balls, musket balls, buttons and coins in and around Chedzoy gardens, private land, is that it strongly indicates that the battle passed through Chedzoy. And I know that that we've theorized that was obviously there was occupancy during the Civil War as well. But again, with the thoughts and the scripts that have come from Steve's book, which has correlated the fact that there were people running through the streets of Chedzoy, knocking on people's doors. There was obviously people coming into Chedzoy from different angles, from ways. So I think you're absolutely right, Simon. There's another debate that I'm sure those who live in Chedzoy would like to
can I quickly just add something, Mark? Because I think what's fascinating is that these, which hopefully you can see, that the tops of what we call bandolier cases, and there's a set here of historical ones. These were the only units that had these were Monmouth's army, because all the government troops that entered that area after the battle had cartridges. So only Monmouth's rebels, if you like, or the Wades regiments, etc., would have had lead-lined or lead.
Can you show that? Can you show that closer to the camera? Because I know that there's been those who've been recovered from gardens in the strip along Front Street. We found them in our garden. I know John's found one in his garden with basketballs and such like. So again, that reinforces the theory.
Each one of those, this is a modern reproduction, okay, that indicates one of Monmouth's men stood there and fired his musket.
Okay, well, they've been found up that lane where the second red arrow is. So that would confirm that. Yeah, absolutely. But again,
sorry, I'll let you carry on. Sorry.
No, exactly. And I think this is why it does warrant a follow-up. And in fact, what I'll do is I'll pass over to you, Nick, because you can cover off where we would like to go from here.
Right. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, one of the fascinating things about the whole story is it evolves and it throws up new facts as you come across more and more primary sources, get in touch with people like Steve and so on, and there's still a vast amount of things that we would like to know more about. There's a windmill on the in the Chedzoy cornfields, or a former windmill site. That's mentioned as what sounds to me to be quite an intense battle, because they recovered 42 rebel bodies from the windmill. We've got a reasonably accurate idea of where that is. We'd love to be able to tie down the vedette. Vedette simply being a sort of archaic word for a mounted cavalry sentry, if you like, or a patrol at the site of the Langmoor Stone. We think we've got a rough idea of which field it's in. The campsite, I think that's one Steve's quite interested in, because again, if there was some way to determine the orientation of that, then we would have a more complete picture of the way they deployed and the direction they were facing. And then finally, Compton's patrol off to the east or to the right of the map there. If we can tie down any physical evidence or any ground and map studies and walking the ground, that's another thing we'd like to look into. What we want to do when the weather improves and lockdown it ceases to be as restrictive as it has been, is do a really good quality drone survey of the route leading from onto the moor all the way down to the battlefield and then back through Chedzoy, and put that together as a kind of aerial battlefield tour, if you like. So that's something on the cards for later in the year when the weather improves. And then finally, obviously the ultimate, again, lockdown related, is to get back into physically walking the ground again, rather than staring at screens as we have been doing. So that's some of our future intentions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So again, just before we wind up, we did offer the opportunity for questions. Can I just pin it down to 2? Nick or Mark, have you been monitoring the chat?
We've actually got 4 questions. If we can whip through them quickly. Shall I just read them out? Because David has said, why is one spot called Wade's Last Stand when it was a continuous fighting retreat and perhaps 300 members of the Red Regiment and Wade made it back to Bridgewater? I would throw that one at Steve.
Because the historical accounts, the current wisdom, if you like, or the pre-fighting for liberty wisdom, was that it was a last stand, basically Wade holding that crossing point back, fending off the cavalry, and it was once they got across, they then basically post-hated, quickly as possible to Bridgewater. That's the traditional view. That's the David Chandler view, and the more sort of, if you like, I don't know, the little General Jack, but that's the sort of the historical view or the contextual view. However, the research and the findings that we've done, and using Monmouth's account, using all the other eyewitness accounts, then changing the orientation slightly, suddenly you get this fighting retreat. So the reason we talk about Wade's Last Stand being on the battlefield is because that's where everybody tends to think of it. It's now probably more likely further in towards the junction at Chedzoy than it is down on the battlefield. So that's why it's just historic.
I think that again it goes back to what you said at the back end of your talk there. I've got another question. I've been quick as I go through these, but I'd like to get this one answered because this is from one of our non-locals, i.e. someone from USA. So these rines or drainage ditches, how deep are these? How deep are these? When the new ditches were dug, I assume in the 19th century, were any artifacts discovered? Anyone like to, well, I suppose you did touch on that a little bit, both General Jack and Steve, in terms of the depth then. Do you want to just...
Yeah, I mean, I can quickly give... So when the King Sedgemoor drain was dug, they did find, I believe, a burial pit out on the far flank. But as far as that goes, no, they pretty much dug it. It was 1784, I think it was, around that period. So there wasn't much thought about it, to be honest, when they dug that. That then changed the whole drainage system of the moor. And then you've got the Chedzoy new cut that goes through the middle of the battlefield. Those just totally changed it, and the Bussocks then drained off. It comes back every really bad winter when it's raining really hard. It does come back into formation, but they didn't dig it over. It just disappeared because of the drainage system changed.
I think I'd like to make one comment here, because I live in Wiltshire, and we live in the Nadder Valley, and there are flood meadows there. What is interesting is that the ditches that are dug now, and you go on to Sedgemoor, if you fall into those ditches, you drown. The water will go over your head. There's a 6-foot drop into the ditch, and so on and so forth, because they're dug with mechanical diggers, and they're quite narrow. I mean, 8-10 feet across, perhaps less than that. I reckon that the ditches in the 1680s and that period of time were probably less deep and wider, carry the same amount of water, because actually if you look around here, you can see the old floodplain ditches and the ridging. And what was interesting was to see Bussocks Reen flooded on the photograph that you showed, because that actually was doing what Bussocks Reen was meant to do, taking away the water from higher ground. So it is possible, not probable, because I don't know what I'm talking about really. I'm making this up as I go along, but it's possible that many of these ditches were certainly not as deep and as sharp as the ones they have now. Otherwise, they couldn't have got across the moor.
Also, they flowed as well. They flowed down. They drained the water into the Parrot, so they were flowing. They weren't like the ditches we have today, which is very much pumped out and they're mechanically emptied effectively. Yeah. They are man-made streams effectively taking the water off. So they've been wider but not as deep, and that's certainly my interpretation.
Thank you. I've got a fellow I know quite well. His name's Roger Simonite. He's come up with a question which I think I'd like to put to General Jack, and that is: the battle site appeared to have very little cover. is this the reason for the night attack, or was it just the timings of the day?
I think the reasons for the night attack were twofold. Firstly, he needed secrecy, and he was going to get no secrecy by advancing across that open ground in daylight. They were going to be drawn up well in advance of the Monmouth's army arrival at their battle positions. And remember that the range they were talking about was 80 yards, 100 yards, nothing in today's terms. And the other reason was that this gave Monmouth the greatest chance of firstly surprise, and therefore creating the level of disruption that he thought he might achieve in order for him to break contact. And it gave him daylight hours to withdraw, because he probably would choose to move by day, because in the end you move faster by day. There aren't so many constraints imposed upon you. It's not so difficult. And again, I'm slightly making this up as I go along, but I don't think there's anything to do with the cover, because actually people didn't use cover. You couldn't load your weapon lying down. You had to be standing up, or at least kneeling. So all sorts of things constrained the whole concept of cover. Covered approaches to stop people seeing you moving there, but once you joined battle, you were standing there and you were visible to everybody.
Thank you.
One more, Mark, please.
Yeah, one more. There's a young James Burt has asked, how many dead were buried out there?
Cool.
Finished on a high note.
I'll finish on a high note. I mean, probably the estimations of the if you like the casualties are varied in terms of the Monmouth's army. Certainly in the region of, I would expect that the accounts talking from memory, I have to check my book to the exact number, was about 380 around that number were buried effectively on the battlefield after the rout. So, which is about the right number for the state of it. And there are a lot more were then captured, and then some were killed afterwards. But I think it was 380 off the top of my head. I will have a look on the appendix of the book. But yeah, that's General Jack. Have you got anything on that? That's check.
Me, no. Was that directed at me?
Yes, I was just going to say the number of casualties. I'm just going to check my book.
It's not a figure that I've got in the back of my mind. I haven't got anything.
It's in that order of magnitude, isn't it? And I know that there were accounts of demands put on the local villages to provide oxen to basically dig burial pits, to plough the land, dig burial pits, and they then put sand and lime down over the dead bodies. So there was 300 to 500 people out there. I mean, we can find out.
Simon, I think the interesting thing is that we have so few dead bodies, so few dead during the battle, when you consider that large numbers of men were 80 yards apart for several hours, firing at each other. Same with Waterloo. I mean, God knows how many rounds were fired at Waterloo, and 20,000 soldiers died at Waterloo. But it's estimated that well over 1 million rounds were fired at Waterloo by the British alone. Something of that order, perhaps more.
Yeah,
there were remarkably few deaths when you think of the amount of lead flying around. Perhaps we just become used to automatic weapons firing at 600 rounds a minute over 800 meters and all the rest of it, which are much more effective killers. I mean, it's bad enough you got hit by a lead musket ball, but I'm always struck by the relatively small number who appear to get killed.
Yeah, I've just checked the numbers, and there's one account that's talking about over 1,000 killed beyond the battlefield in terms of the rout, and then I think it's 174 was one account of the men buried in one of the pits. So yeah, it's remarkably small actually on the battlefield. The whole purpose of the cavalry is to chase up and kill the men as they run, and once you break an army, you follow up with the cavalry and they do the slaughter, if you like, but it doesn't tend to be on the battlefield. It's beyond the extremities, which is why it's really important to keep the units together, like Wade did.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, gentlemen, I'm going to call things to a halt there. Otherwise, I'm sure we could talk all night. And it sounds like we do need to do something of a follow-up, because we've only really just touched on the end of the established battle. And we know there's far, far more to talk about beyond that and into the bloody assizes and everything else. But we are where we are. So can I thank you both for your time this evening and for your extra time this evening, and for the audience for dialing in, and for Mark and Nick for helping run the evening. I think, just to recap, I said at the start, it was going to be a unique opportunity, and I think it really, really was, to have these two expert speakers on this subject on one screen, as it were, not quite in one room, is a unique opportunity, and it's been fantastic. I think the balance of the established history, and I think the little disagreement, actually, as I said before, to add colour and depth, not to rewrite history. And I think that's pretty much, it feels to me, that's what we've been doing here, extending our knowledge, not replacing things, and to inspire further interest and research, which I'm sure, I hope that the people on the line, I'm seeing really nice messages come up, and I know that we're going to carry on, do more in the future. I'd like to end it by saying I hope to meet you all on the battlefield one day. You don't say that to many people in life, but I really hope we can soon, and that you all stay safe and well, and we're out of this chaos and craziness before much longer, and we can see you out in the real world. But thank you all, and I wish you well, and good night.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
And the link for the charity is in the. Can you mention that, Simon?
Yes, sorry. It's the link for the charity is on the page now, isn't it?
It's on the chat page. I'll put it onto the Facebook groups as well.
Yeah.
So if I go back, there's the event Facebook. So the Facebook group that this event was used for, there's a revisited chat group. It will be posted back up on there. And I just also point you towards, I don't know if it's your group, Stephen, but the Monmouth Rebellion 1685 group on Facebook is also a worthy place to catch up with you as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Well reminded, Mark. Okay. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you
very much. Thank you.